Have you ever felt underestimated, trapped in a life that doesn't feel like your own? What if the key to your freedom was a secret held by the one person you trust the most? Tonight's story is about a woman who was publicly humiliated by her millionaire husband. But he made one fatal mistake. He forgot about her brother, who was about to unleash a truth that would shatter an entire dynasty. Stay tuned for a story of betrayal, revenge, and the unbreakable bond of family. The silence in the grand dining room of the Kingswell estate was heavier than the crystal chandeliers overhead. All eyes were on Maricel, pinned by the cruel spotlight of her husband's words. Dorian, the millionaire heir whose arm she held just moments ago, now stood alone, a champagne flute in hand. He used it like a scepter to command the room's attention as he systematically dismantled her. He called her simple, a charming little project he'd picked up. He mocked her family, her dreams, her very essence. And in front of his parents, his siblings, and 50 of New York's elite, he presented her with a gift meant to be the final crushing blow. But he made one fatal miscalculation. He hadn't accounted for her brother, Liam, sitting silently in the corner. What Liam said next wouldn't just offend his sister. It would detonate a bomb that would bring the entire Kingswell dynasty to its knees. The late afternoon sun cast long, elegant shadows across the manicured lawns of the Kingswell family's ancestral home in Greenwich, Connecticut. From the passenger seat of Dorian's Bentley, Maricel watched the sprawling Tudor mansion grow larger. Its ivy-clad stone walls seemed to absorb the light, leaving an impression of old, unassailable power. The house didn't welcome you, it judged you. Are you nervous? Dorian asked, his voice as smooth as the polished mahogany dashboard. He didn't look at her. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were fixed on the winding gravel driveway. A little, Maricel admitted, smoothing down the silk of her emerald green dress for the 10th time. It was a dress Dorian had chosen. It's your parents' 40th anniversary. It's a big occasion. It's the Kingswell 40th anniversary, he corrected, a subtle but significant amendment. Everything we do is a big occasion. Just remember what we talked about. Smile. Let me do most of the talking. And for God's sake, don't mention your little art projects unless someone asks you directly. And even then, keep it brief. Hobbyist is the word you'll use. Marisol's fingers tightened on her small clutch. Inside it was her phone, with a picture of her latest oil painting, a chaotic, vibrant cityscape she was particularly proud of. She'd wanted to show it to Dorian, to see a flicker of genuine pride in his eyes, but she knew better. To Dorian Kingswell, her art was not a passion. It was a quaint, slightly embarrassing pastime, like a child's rock collection. Their marriage, just shy of 2 years old, had started as a whirlwind romance. Maricel, a librarian with a fierce love for literature and a hidden talent for painting, had met Dorian at a charity gala she'd attended with a friend. He was charming, impossibly handsome, and showered her with a kind of attention that felt like sunshine. He'd pursued her relentlessly, making her believe she was the most fascinating woman in the world. He'd loved her stories about growing up in a small, boisterous, middle-class family in Ohio. He'd called her real and untainted. The reality she soon learned was that he saw her as a beautiful, unpolished stone he could cut and set to his own specifications. Once the ring was on her finger, the sunshine of his attention became a harsh, interrogating light. Her opinions became naive, her background unrefined, and her family provincial. He'd isolated her, not with bars and locks, but with a velvet rope of condescension. Slowly convincing her that she was lucky to be in his orbit, that she needed his guidance to navigate the treacherous waters of his world. The Bentley crunched to a halt before the imposing oak doors of the mansion. A valet, dressed in a crisp uniform, materialized as if from the earth itself. Dorian handed him the keys without a glance. "One more thing," Dorian said, turning to her at last. His hand cupped her chin, his thumb brushing her lip. It looked like a tender gesture, but his grip was firm, a reminder of his control. Your brother Liam. He's already here. I trust you've instructed him on the proper etiquette. A knot of dread tightened in Marisol's stomach. Liam knows how to behave, Dorian. Does he? Dorian's lip curled into a smirk. Last Christmas, he tried to engage my father in a debate about wealth inequality at the dinner table. We're not looking for a repeat of that performance. Tell him to stick to safe topics, the weather, sports, anything that doesn't require critical thought. Marisol pulled her chin away, the gesture costing her a significant amount of courage. My brother is one of the most intelligent people I know. He's a mid-level software engineer from Columbus, darling, Dorian scoffed, adjusting his tie. His intelligence is functional, not sophisticated. There's a difference. Just keep him in check. I don't want my parents' anniversary ruined by some blue-collar sermon on the virtues of the working class. He exited the car, expecting her to follow. Marisol took a deep breath, the scent of leather and Dorian's expensive cologne filling her lungs. She felt like a doll being positioned in a dollhouse. She got out of the car, the gravel unsteady beneath her heels, and forced a smile as Dorian took her arm, his grip possessive. As they walked toward the great doors, they swung open. There, framed in the doorway, stood Eleanora Kingswell, Dorian's mother. She was a woman carved from ice, draped in Chanel. Her silver hair was coiled into an impeccable chignon, and her eyes, the same stormy gray as her son's, swept over Marisol's dress. Her hair, her chausse a silent, withering appraisal. Dorian, darling, she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. She offered her cheek for a kiss. You're just in time. Richard is holding court in the study. She finally acknowledged Marisol. Marisol. That color is bold. It's Bottega, mother, Dorian said dismissively. I picked it out. Eleanora's expression softened fractionally. Well, in that case, it's a statement. She turned, leading them into a grand foyer with a soaring ceiling and a marble floor that echoed their footsteps like a mausoleum. Most of the guests are in the conservatory. Your sister Victoria is here, of course. From the arched entrance to the conservatory, Marisol saw him, her brother, Liam. He stood alone near a large potted fern, holding a glass of sparkling water, looking profoundly out of place and entirely unbothered by it. He wasn't tall and classically handsome like Dorian. Liam was built more sturdily, with kind, intelligent eyes and a calm, observant demeanor that missed nothing. He wore a simple, well-tailored navy suit that Marisol knew he'd bought specifically for this occasion, probably wincing at the price tag. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for the first time all day, Marisol felt a genuine warmth spread through her chest. He gave her a small, reassuring nod, a silent message that said, I'm here. You're not alone. Dorian followed her gaze, his grip on her arm tightening. Ah, there's the man of the people, he muttered under his breath, a venomous edge to his tone. Try to keep him away from the silver. Before Marisol could respond, Dorian propelled her forward into the heart of the viper's nest. The manufactured smile was plastered back on her face. The gilded cage had closed around her, and the performance had begun. She could only pray they would all survive the night. The conservatory was a masterpiece of iron and glass, filled with the cloying scent of orchids and expensive perfume. The air hummed with the low thrum of polite, powerful conversation. Men in bespoke suits discussed mergers and acquisitions, while women with surgically perfected faces traded gossip like currency. Marisol felt like a foreign species, an exotic bird with feathers too bright, introduced into a flock of sleek, predatory crows. Dorian, in his element, navigated the room with effortless grace. He was a prince in his kingdom. He'd release Marisol's arm to shake a hand, his laughter booming as he shared an inside joke with a hedge fund manager, only to reclaim her moments later, pulling her back into his orbit. Each introduction was a subtle performance of ownership. This is my wife, Marisol, he'd say, a proprietary hand on the small of her back. She keeps me grounded. The words were meant to sound endearing, but the subtext was clear to everyone in their circle: she is my charmingly simple accessory. Victoria, Dorian's younger sister, slinked over to them, a flute of champagne in her perfectly manicured hand. She had their mother's sharp features and none of her restraint. "Maricel, darling," she cooed, air-kissing the space beside Marisol's cheek. "I almost didn't recognize you. You look so vibrant. Did you do your own makeup tonight?" The insult was as sharp and thin as a needle. Marisol's smile tightened. "It's good to see you, too, Victoria." "Oh, and I see your brother made it," Victoria said, her eyes flicking over to where Liam stood. "How lovely. Does he have to work tomorrow? I hear the tech world is just relentless." "All that coding," she said, the word coding as if it were a communicable disease. "Liam's company gives him plenty of time off," Maricel said, her voice cooler than she intended. Dorian shot her a warning look. "Victoria, be nice. We must make an effort for family, even the temporary kind." He winked, but the malice was unmistakable. It was a private joke between them, a reference to the Kingswell prenuptial agreement that Maricel had been forced to sign. A document that made it painfully clear her position was conditional. The barb landed, stealing Marisol's breath. Before she could process the sting, Dorian's father, Richard Kingswell, clapped his son on the shoulder. Richard was a portly man whose jovial exterior masked a shrewd, ruthless mind that had built a small manufacturing business into the corporate behemoth of Kingswell Industries. "Dorian, there you are. I was just telling Senator Thompson about your new acquisition. Brilliant move, son. Absolutely ruthless." He beamed. Then his eyes fell on Maricel. "And Maricel? Lovely. Just lovely." He patted her arm with a dismissive finality, his attention already back on his son. Maricel felt herself shrinking, becoming invisible. She was a ghost at the feast, a prop in their family portrait. Her gaze drifted back to Liam. He was no longer alone. An older gentleman, someone Maricel didn't recognize, was speaking to him animatedly. Liam was listening intently, a thoughtful expression on his face. For a moment, she felt a pang of jealousy. He could connect with people so easily, without pretense. She excused herself under the pretense of needing some air and made her way to him. As she approached, she heard the end of their conversation. "And that's why the integrity of the initial code base is paramount," Liam was saying. "You can build a palace on top of it, but if the foundation is sand, it's all coming down eventually." "Aptly put, young man," the older gentleman said, shaking Liam's hand warmly. "It was a pleasure. You have a keen mind." The man walked away, and Liam turned to Maricel, his smile finally reaching his eyes. "Hey, Ellie. You holding up?" "Barely," she whispered, her facade crumbling now that she was with him. "This place is suffocating." "Who was that?" "Arthur Lexington," Liam said casually. "He's on the board of a major tech investment firm. We were just talking shop." Maricel stared. "You were talking shop with Arthur Lexington?" "Yeah, he's surprisingly down to earth. He asked what I did, and we got into a discussion about encryption protocols." Liam shrugged, taking a sip of his water. "He didn't seem to care that I'm from Ohio." The simplicity of it, the normalcy, was a stark contrast to the social minefield she'd been navigating. With Liam, things were just real. "Dorian is in rare form tonight," she said, her voice low. "He warned me to keep you in check." Liam's jaw tightened, the only outward sign of his anger. He looked across the room at Dorian, who was now laughing with a circle of his sycophantic friends, his arm draped possessively around the back of a chair where a striking brunette sat. "That guy," Liam said, his voice laced with a contempt he rarely showed. He's a peacock, Ellie. All feathers. Take away the name and the money, and what's left? Don't, Liam. Please. Just for tonight, let's not cause any trouble. Trouble? Liam's gaze softened as he looked back at her. I'm not the one causing trouble. Look at you. You're walking on eggshells. This isn't you. The Ellie I know would be telling that Victoria woman exactly where she can shove her backhanded compliments. The Ellie you know isn't married to a Kingswell, she said, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. It's different now. I have to be careful. Careful of what? Of them finding out you have a spine. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry. I know this is hard, but I hate seeing you like this. It's like he's dimming your light. Before she could answer, a small bell chimed, and a butler announced that dinner was served. The swarm of guests began to migrate towards the dining room. Dorian appeared at her side again, his good mood apparently restored. There you are, he said, taking her arm. Come on, father wants to give a toast before the first course. He glanced at Liam. Ah, the brother-in-law. Do try to use the correct fork, won't you? There are 3. Liam just smiled a thin, unreadable smile. Don't worry, Dorian. I'll manage. As they were herded into the cavernous dining room, Maricel felt a shiver of premonition. The table was an impossibly long stretch of polished mahogany, set with glittering silverware and crystal. A platoon of servants stood silently against the walls. The air was thick with anticipation. It felt less like a celebration and more like a tribunal. She was seated between Dorian and his father. Liam was placed far down the other end of the table, next to a cousin of Dorian's who seemed engrossed in her phone. They were separated, isolated, a deliberate tactic. Richard Kingswell stood, raising his glass. He gave a heartfelt, if somewhat generic, speech about his 40 years with Eleonora. It was met with polite, warm applause. Then Eleonora stood and said a few words, praising her husband's ambition and their family's legacy. Then, Dorian stood up. He tapped his glass with a fork, and a hush fell over the room. His eyes scanned the table, and they landed on Maricel. He smiled a wide, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. I, too, would like to say a few words, he began, his voice resonating with confidence. About family, about legacy, and about the wonderful partners who stand beside us. He paused, letting the room hang on his words. My father found his perfect partner in my mother, a woman of grace, strength, and impeccable breeding. He turned his gaze fully on Maricel, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. And I, he continued, found Maricel. The storm that had been gathering all evening was about to break, and Maricel knew with a sickening certainty that she was standing right in the center of it. Dorian held the room in the palm of his hand. 50 pairs of eyes, belonging to some of the most influential people on the East Coast, were fixed on him and, by extension, on his wife. Maricel felt like an insect under a magnifying glass, the heat intensifying with every word he spoke. When I first met Maricel, Dorian said, his tone a perfect blend of feigned affection and condescension, I was utterly charmed. She was so refreshingly simple. A librarian from Ohio. He paused, letting the quiet laughter ripple through the loyalists at the table. She didn't know the difference between a Monet and a Manet, or a Bordeaux and a Burgundy. But she had a good heart. A very, very good heart. Every word was a carefully crafted insult wrapped in the guise of a compliment. He was painting a portrait of her as a clueless waif he had magnanimously rescued from obscurity. Marisol's hands were balled into fists in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She kept her eyes fixed on her water glass, trying to will herself to become invisible. She could feel the pitying glances from some, the smug satisfaction from others, especially from Victoria and Eleonora. She brought a certain rustic authenticity to my life, Dorian went on, warming to his theme. He was performing, and this was his grand soliloquy. She reminded me that there's a whole world out there of people who work 9 to 5 jobs, who worry about mortgages, who think a vacation to Disney World is the height of luxury. More polite, cruel laughter. Maricel risked a glance down the table at Liam. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were blazing. He wasn't looking at Dorian. He was looking at her, a question in his gaze. How much more are you going to take? She wanted to scream, to stand up and throw her water in Dorian's handsome, smug face. But she was paralyzed by the weight of 2 years of his systematic conditioning. He had convinced her that any emotional outburst would only prove his point that she was unsophisticated, unsuited for his world. So she sat there and took it, a silent, smiling statue of misery. And in her own little way, she tries so hard to fit in, Dorian said, his voice dripping with mock tenderness. She's even taken up a little hobby, painting. She buys canvases and little tubes of paint and spends hours in her studio creating what she calls art. He said the word art as if it were a child's finger painting. The humiliation was a physical thing now, a hot flush that crawled up her neck and burned her cheeks. The cityscape painting she'd been so proud of suddenly felt foolish, a pathetic, childish endeavor. He was taking the one thing that was hers, the one thing he hadn't managed to control or corrupt, and he was trivializing it in front of the entire world. I find it endearing, Dorian said, his smile widening. It's important for a woman to have something to keep her occupied, isn't it? And in honor of my parents' anniversary, a celebration of enduring partnership, I wanted to give my own partner a little something. A token of my appreciation for all her efforts. He nodded to the butler, who stepped forward, holding a flat, rectangular object wrapped in cheap, brightly colored birthday paper. The wrapping was a statement in itself, a stark, deliberate contrast to the elegant, muted tones of the evening. It was something you'd buy at a dollar store for a child's party. The butler placed the package on the table in front of Maricel. The silence was absolute now, thick with a kind of morbid curiosity. Everyone was waiting for the punchline. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The cheap paper crinkled loudly in the cavernous room. She tore it open, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. Inside was a paint-by-numbers kit. It was a picture of a pastoral scene, a field of cartoonish kittens playing with a ball of yarn. The box proclaimed in cheerful letters, for ages 6 and up. No talent required. A collective gasp went through the room, followed by a wave of snickers and outright laughter. Victoria let out a high-pitched titter of delight. Eleanora Kingswell's lips pressed into a thin, satisfied line. Dorian just stood there, beaming, basking in the glory of his perfectly executed cruelty. He had not only insulted her passion, he had publicly declared it, and by extension her, to be juvenile and worthless. Tears pricked at Marisol's eyes, hot and sharp. She fought them back, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She looked at the box, at the idiotic, smiling kittens, and something inside her, something that had been slowly dying for 2 years, finally fractured. The gilded cage had become a torture chamber, and she could no longer pretend it was a home. She looked up, her gaze sweeping past Dorian's triumphant face, past his mother's cold smirk, past the sea of mocking and pitying eyes, until she found Liam. He was no longer looking at her. His eyes, cold and hard as chips of granite, were locked on Dorian. The mask of calm had finally fallen away, replaced by an expression of pure, focused rage. He had pushed his chair back slightly from the table, his body language coiled and ready. Dorian, still enjoying his moment, finally seemed to notice the shift in atmosphere, the sudden deadly quiet that had fallen over the far end of the table. He followed Marisol's gaze to Liam. "Is there a problem?" Dorian asked, his voice still laced with arrogance but now with a hint of irritation. "Does the help have something to say?" Liam didn't rise to the bait. He didn't shout. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply placed his napkin neatly on the table beside his plate. When he spoke, his voice was calm, clear, and carried to every corner of the silent room. It was the calm of a bomb disposal expert about to cut the final wire. "Actually, Dorian, yes," Liam said, his eyes never leaving Dorian's. "I do have something to say." He slowly, deliberately rose to his feet. Every person at the table, including Richard and Eleanora Kingswell, turned to face him. The air crackled with tension. This was not the outburst of a hot-headed brother. This was something else entirely. This was an execution. "You talk a lot about value, Dorian," Liam began, his voice dangerously even. "About worth, about good breeding. You sit here in this house built on your father's success, wearing a suit that costs more than my car, and you dare to pass judgment on my sister's soul. My sister's soul is not a commodity to be appraised." Liam's voice grew colder, sharper. "But since we're on the topic of value, and things that are not what they seem, let's talk about your company, Kingswell Innovations." At the mention of the company name, Richard Kingswell stiffened. Dorian's smug expression flickered, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion, then annoyance. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Dorian snapped. "But this is wildly inappropriate." "Is it?" Liam asked, a humorless smile touching his lips. "I think it's the most appropriate conversation we could possibly have. Because, you see, a few months ago, a friend of mine, a truly brilliant programmer named Ben Carter, came to me devastated. The startup he'd poured his life into had imploded. His lead investor pulled out after his proprietary algorithm was stolen. A unique piece of code for predictive market analysis. He called it Project Chimera." Liam paused, letting the name hang in the air. He looked directly at Dorian, whose face had begun to lose its color. "Project Chimera," Liam repeated slowly, savoring the words. "Does that name ring a bell, Dorian?" "It should. It's the core of the new fintech platform that Kingswell Innovations is launching next quarter. The one that has investors lining up, the one your father praised you for being absolutely ruthless in acquiring." The room was deathly quiet. Maricel stared, her own humiliation forgotten, replaced by a dizzying sense of confusion and dread. She saw Dorian's hand, the one holding the champagne flute, begin to tremble. Liam took a small step away from the table, as if to give himself space. "The thing about code," he said, his voice now like a surgeon's scalpel, "is that it's like DNA. A good programmer always leaves a signature. Little quirks, inefficiencies, personal trademarks. And Ben Carter's signature is all over your revolutionary new platform. But that's not the best part." Liam reached into his suit jacket pocket. For a terrifying second, Maricel thought he might pull out a weapon. Instead, he withdrew his phone. "The best part," he said, his eyes boring into Dorian's, "is that before Ben's servers were professionally wiped, he'd made a deep backup. A backup that contains the original code, the metadata, the timestamps, and a very interesting encrypted email trail." Liam's gaze swept from Dorian to his father, Richard. "An email trail that leads directly from Ben's ex-partner to a private encrypted server registered to a shell corporation. A corporation that, after about 30 minutes of digging, I traced back to a holding company owned by Kingswell Industries." He held up his phone. "It's all right here, Dorian. The original code, the emails, the proof that the $10 billion platform your entire company's future is riding on is built on a lie. It's stolen. And I have a feeling that Arthur Lexington, the man from the tech investment firm I was just chatting with, will be fascinated to hear all about the integrity of your codebase." Dorian Kingswell, the millionaire heir, the prince in his castle, the man who had just moments ago commanded the entire room, was no longer smiling. His face, once flush with triumph, had turned a ghostly, bloodless white. He looked as if he'd been punched in the gut, all the air and arrogance knocked out of him in one swift, brutal blow. He stared at Liam, his mouth slightly agape. And for the first time in the 2 years Maricel had known him, Dorian Kingswell looked well and truly, utterly terrified. He was pale. The silence that followed Liam's declaration was a living entity. It was profound and absolute, broken only by the sound of a single ornate fork clattering from someone's nerveless fingers onto a china plate. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot in the tomb-like stillness of the dining room. Dorian stood frozen, his face a mask of chalky horror. The bravado, the arrogance, the casual cruelty, it had all evaporated, leaving behind a hollow-eyed man staring at his own executioner. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. A small, strangled noise caught in his throat. It was Richard Kingswell who broke the spell. He slammed his fist on the table, the heavy thud making the crystal glasses jump. "That is enough," he boomed, his face a mottled, apoplectic red. "Security." 2 burly men in black suits who had been standing discreetly by the main entrance started to move forward. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Kingswell," Liam said, his voice retaining its chilling calm. He didn't even look at the approaching guards. His eyes were still locked on Dorian. "Unless you want me to press send on a lovely little email I have queued up. The recipient list is quite impressive, the SEC, the board of directors of your publicly traded parent company, and a few choice journalists at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. I believe they call that market manipulation and wire fraud. The prison sentences for those are quite a bit longer than for trespassing." The security guards stopped dead in their tracks, looking to Richard for guidance. The elder Kingswell seemed to deflate, sinking back into his chair. The fury in his eyes was replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. He looked at his son, a look of utter contempt and disbelief. "Dorian. What is this lunatic talking about?" Dorian finally found his voice, though it was a reedy, desperate whisper. "He's lying. It's a shakedown. He's trying to extort us." "Am I?" Liam asked, arching an eyebrow. He tapped his phone screen. "Let me be more specific so you understand this isn't a lie. I'm referring to the acquisition files stored on your internal server under the project name, Project Daedalus. The purchase was from a holding company called Innovest Solutions, registered in the Cayman Islands. That's your shell. The transfer of funds to the seller, your friend, the one who betrayed Ben Carter, was funneled through 3 separate offshore accounts. But you got sloppy on the last one. You used a subsidiary of a Kingswell Industries partner bank to finalize it. The digital transaction record has a routing number that traces back here. To your family office." Each detail was a nail being hammered into Dorian's coffin. Liam wasn't bluffing. He had done his homework. He had the receipts. The functional, unsophisticated, software engineer from Ohio had just dismantled a multi-billion-dollar corporate conspiracy in under 5 minutes. Eleanora Kingswell, who had watched the entire exchange with a look of icy disdain, finally spoke. Her voice was thin and brittle. "Get him out of my house." "He's not going anywhere," a new voice said. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension with absolute clarity. It was Maricel. She had risen to her feet, her own chair pushed back. The tears that had threatened to fall were gone. The humiliation she had felt just minutes ago had been burned away by the fires of Liam's revelation, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She looked at Dorian, truly looked at him, not as her husband, not as the man she had once loved, but as a hollow fraud. A cruel, pathetic child who built his castle on stolen sand. "Maricel, sit down," Dorian hissed, a frantic edge to his voice. "This has nothing to do with you." "Doesn't it?" she replied, her voice steady. She picked up the paint-by-numbers kit from the table. She held it not like a victim, but like a piece of evidence. "You stood here and you stripped me bare in front of all these people. You called me simple, worthless, a hobbyist. You tried to humiliate me by mocking the one thing that brought me joy." She looked from the box to Dorian's pale face. And all the while, you were the real fraud, the real pretender. You talk about value and legacy, but you have no value of your own. You didn't build anything. You stole it. Your entire success, the very thing that gives you the right to stand here and look down on me, is a lie. The guests were utterly captivated. This was no longer just a family squabble. It was the public implosion of a dynasty. They were watching the fall of the House of Kingswell in real time. Victoria started to stammer, "How dare you speak to my brother?" "Be quiet, Victoria," Maricel snapped, her voice sharp as glass. Victoria flinched back as if struck. Maricel turned her attention to her brother. "Liam, you have all of it." "The proof?" "Every last bite," he confirmed. She took a deep, steadying breath. The fog of the past 2 years was lifting. She saw the manipulations, the gaslighting, the endless condescension for what it was. A desperate attempt by an insecure man to control someone he knew, deep down, was his better. He had to diminish her light because he was terrified it would outshine his own. "Good," she said. She then turned back to Dorian, her eyes as cold as his mother's. 2 weeks ago, Dorian, she said, her voice dropping to an almost conversational tone, which was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "You told me that my prenuptial agreement was ironclad, and that if I ever thought of leaving, I would walk away with nothing but the clothes on my back. You reminded me that you had the best lawyers money could buy. You said it would be social and financial suicide for me." Dorian stared at her, a new kind of fear entering his eyes. This wasn't about his company anymore. This was about her. "Well, I have a little revelation of my own," Maricel continued. "Last week, I had a very quiet, very discreet meeting with a woman named Jessica Albright. She's a partner at Cohen, Stern, and Albright. I believe you know the firm. They specialize in contentious divorces for high-net-worth individuals." A wave of shock rippled through the room. Richard Kingswell's jaw dropped. "I gave Ms. Albright a copy of our prenup," Maricel said. "And she found it very interesting, especially the full disclosure clause regarding assets at the time of signing. You see, the initial seed money you used to acquire the technology for Kingswell Innovations came from a joint investment account we opened shortly after our wedding. An account that, according to the terms of the prenup, is considered marital property." She let that sink in. "Your lawyers will argue it was your money to begin with. My lawyer will argue that you fraudulently misrepresented the nature of the investment, using marital funds to purchase stolen property, thereby exposing me, your wife, to significant legal and financial liability without my knowledge or consent." She called it a flagrant breach of fiduciary duty. A breach she believes is significant enough to invalidate the entire prenuptial agreement. She gave him a small, chilling smile. "So it turns out, Dorian, that I'm not entitled to nothing. I'm entitled to half. Half of everything. Half of the house, half of the stocks, and half of a company whose primary asset is about to become the subject of a massive federal investigation." She placed the paint-by-numbers kit back on the table with a soft thud. "Enjoy your party," she said. Then she turned, walked over to her brother, took his arm, and together they walked out of the dining room. Leaving behind a tableau of ruin, a pale, broken man, a disgraced family, and a room full of powerful people who had just witnessed the spectacular detonation of the Kingswell Empire. The silence they left in their wake was no longer heavy. It was the hollow sound of absolute devastation. The walk from the dining room, through the grand foyer, and out the imposing oak doors felt like surfacing from a deep, murky dive. Each step Maricel took alongside Liam was a step back into the clean, breathable air of her own life. The sound of their shoes on the marble floor was crisp and defiant. Behind them, a muffled uproar began to erupt, the sound of a carefully constructed world shattering. But they didn't look back. Once outside, in the cool, damp night air, Maricel let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 2 years. The adrenaline was still pumping through her veins, a dizzying cocktail of terror, rage, and exhilarating freedom. "Are you okay?" Liam asked, his voice laced with concern as he guided her down the stone steps. "Okay." She stopped and looked at him, a wild, incredulous laugh bubbling up from her chest. "Liam, I don't even know what I am. I feel like I just woke up from a coma." "You were incredible in there, Ellie," he said, his hand squeezing her arm reassuringly. "Absolutely incredible. I was just going to expose him. You salted the earth." The valet, looking bewildered by the sudden exodus, scrambled to bring Liam's rental car around a modest Ford sedan that looked comically out of place next to the fleet of luxury vehicles. As they waited, Marisol's mind replayed the scene, Dorian's pale face, Richard's apoplectic rage, the stunned silence of the guests. "How did you know, Liam?" she asked, her voice quiet. "About all of it. Ben Carter. Project Chimera. All of it." Liam leaned against a stone balustrade, the manicured garden stretching out behind him into the darkness. "Ben and I go way back. We were roommates in college. He's a genius, but a trusting one. When he told me his work was stolen, he was broken. He mentioned his ex-partner had been talking to some East Coast money, and that the guy was arrogant, came from an established family. A bell went off in my head." He shook his head, a look of disgust on his face. "So I started digging. It wasn't hard. Dorian thinks money can buy silence. But in the tech world, secrets are just data. And data always leaves a trail. It took me about 2 weeks of late nights to piece it all together. I was going to go to the authorities directly. But then you told me about this anniversary party. I knew I had to be here. I couldn't let you walk into that viper's nest alone. I just didn't realize he was going to hand me the perfect opportunity on a silver platter." The Ford pulled up, its headlights cutting through the gloom. They got in, the simple cloth interior a welcome comfort after the cold opulence of the Bentley. As Liam pulled away from the Kingswell estate, its brightly lit windows looking like the eyes of a dying beast, Marisol finally let the tension in her shoulders release. "The lawyer, Ellie," Liam said as he navigated the winding country roads back toward the highway. "Jessica Albright. Were you serious? Have you really been planning this?" This was the part Liam didn't know, the part she hadn't told anyone. Marisol turned in her seat to face him. "Yes," she said softly. "It's been in the works for a month." Liam's eyes widened in surprise. "A month? But why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was ashamed," she admitted, the words tasting like ash. "I was ashamed that I'd let it get this bad, that I had married him in the first place. I felt like such a fool. Dorian's favorite tactic was to isolate me, to make me feel like I had no one, that even my own family would think I was an idiot for falling for his act. For a long time, I believed him." She looked out the window, watching the dark trees flash by. The turning point was about 2 months ago. He'd come home from a business trip, and I'd spent the whole week finishing a painting I was really proud of. I was excited to show him. When he saw it, he didn't even look at the canvas. He looked at the floor and noticed a tiny drop of blue paint. He spent the next 20 minutes lecturing me on carelessness and disrespect for his property. Not our property. His. He made me get on my hands and knees and scrub it off the hardwood while he watched. Liam's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "That son of a bitch." "That was it," Marisol continued, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "That was the moment the veil completely dropped. It wasn't about love or partnership. It was about ownership. I was just another one of his possessions. So the next day, I started making calls. I found Jessica Albright. I wasn't just planning to leave him, Liam. I was planning to dismantle the legal and financial cage he'd built around me. Your bombshell tonight. It just accelerated my timeline. It gave me the cannon I needed for a war I was already planning to fight with a pistol. This was the twist. She had not been a damsel in distress, waiting for a white knight. Her brother hadn't rescued her. He had armed her. She had been quietly, methodically plotting her own escape. The realization seemed to dawn on Liam, and his expression shifted from protective anger to profound respect. Wow, he breathed. So the stuff about the prenup, the marital funds. That's all real. Every word. Ms. Albright called it a golden ticket. Dorian was so arrogant, so sure of his own cleverness, that he made a critical error in his financial disclosures. He got the idea for Kingswell Innovations after we were married, and he used our joint funds as the initial leverage. He thought because his name was on the business, it was untouchable. He was wrong. They drove in silence for a few miles, the only sound the hum of the tires on the asphalt. The weight of the evening was settling, the consequences becoming real. Her life was irrevocably changed. She had no home to go back to. Her marriage was a smoking crater, and she was about to enter a legal battle against a wounded and vengeful corporate titan. But she didn't feel scared. She felt free. So, what happens now? Liam asked, pulling onto the interstate. Now, Maricel said, a small, determined smile on her face, now, I check into a hotel. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., I have a call with Jessica Albright. We file. And then I start painting again. But this time, I'm not doing it as a hobby. I'm doing it as a survivor. She reached over and put her hand on her brother's arm. Thank you, Liam. You gave me my voice back tonight. He looked over at her, his eyes shining in the dashboard lights. No, Ellie, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You had it all along. You just needed to decide to use it. As the distant lights of New York City began to glow on the horizon, Maricel knew he was right. The story wasn't about a millionaire husband humiliating his wife. It was about a woman rediscovering her own worth and a brother who held up a mirror to help her see it. The war was just beginning. But for the first time in a very long time, Maricel Kingswell, soon to be Maricel Thorne again, knew without a doubt that she was going to win. The year that followed was a tempest. The Kingswell family, true to form, did not go down without a fight. They unleashed a legal and public relations onslaught. Their high-priced lawyers filed countersuits alleging extortion and defamation. Their PR firms leaked sanitized stories to friendly tabloids, painting Maricel as a bitter, gold-digging opportunist and Liam as a vengeful, failed tech wannabe. But the truth, as Liam had said, was data. And the data was irrefutable. Liam's evidence, presented through proper legal channels, was a digital smoking gun. The SEC launched a formal investigation into Kingswell Industries and its subsidiary, Kingswell Innovations. The stock plummeted. Board members, including Arthur Lexington, revolted. The story of Project Chimera became a cautionary tale in the financial press about corporate espionage. Richard Kingswell was forced to step down as CEO in disgrace, his legacy forever tarnished. Dorian, the golden boy, was the epicenter of the implosion. He was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. Faced with irrefutable proof and the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, he took a plea deal. His sentence was reduced, but he would serve time. The image of Dorian Kingswell in a tailored suit being led from a courthouse in handcuffs became the final, damning photograph of his public life. He was no longer pale. He was broken. Throughout the storm, Maricel remained anchored. Her lawyer, the formidable Jessica Albright, was a shark. She systematically dismantled the Kingswell legal team's arguments. The fraudulent use of marital funds to purchase stolen assets did indeed invalidate key clauses of the prenup. The divorce settlement, when it was finally hammered out away from the prying eyes of the press, was substantial. Not the half she had threatened in a moment of righteous fury, but more than enough to ensure she would never have to worry about money again. More importantly, it was a legal admission of his wrongdoing, a final vindication. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was personal. One crisp autumn afternoon, 16 months after that fateful dinner party, Maricel stood in the middle of a bright, airy gallery space in Chelsea. The walls were white, the floors were polished concrete, and sunlight streamed in through a large skylight. The air smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Hanging on the walls were her paintings. They were vibrant, chaotic, and deeply emotional. There were sprawling cityscapes that captured the loneliness and energy of urban life. There were abstract pieces, riots of color and texture that spoke of inner turmoil and eventual release. And in the center of the main wall, commanding the room, was a massive canvas. It depicted a gilded cage, its door broken and flung wide open, with a flock of brightly colored birds streaming out into a stormy but ultimately hopeful sky. She called the piece Paint by Numbers. The gallery was buzzing with people. It was the opening night of her first solo exhibition, Maricel Thorne, The Gilded Cage. Critics, collectors, and art lovers moved through the space, their hushed conversations a symphony of praise. They spoke of her bold use of color, her raw emotional honesty, her powerful narrative voice. No one called her a hobbyist. They called her an artist. Liam stood beside her, holding a plastic cup of champagne, a proud grin on his face. He'd since left his mid-level job in Ohio. After the Kingswell scandal broke, his friend Ben Carter had received a massive settlement. Together, they had used the funds to launch their own cybersecurity firm, which was already gaining a reputation for its innovative approach and unshakable ethics. "See," Liam said, nudging her gently. "I told you your light was too bright to be dimmed." Maricel smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. "You know, for the longest time I thought my story was about him, about Dorian, about what he did to me." She looked around the gallery, at the tangible proof of her journey hanging on the walls. "But it wasn't. It was always about me, about finding my way back to this." A well-known art critic, a woman whose reviews could make or break a career, approached them. "Miss Thorne," the critic said, her eyes alight with intellectual fire. "Your work is extraordinary. It's ferocious. It's the kind of work that makes you feel something. Tell me, what's next for you?" Maricel looked past the critic, through the large front window of the gallery at the bustling New York street. She saw a world of infinite possibility, a blank canvas waiting for her touch. She was no longer Maricel Kingswell, the millionaire's wife. She was Maricel Thorne, the artist. She was the one holding the brush. "Everything," she replied, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable confidence. "Absolutely everything." A few years later, another opening night. This time, the gallery was even bigger, the buzz even louder. Maricel, now an established name in the art world, moved through the crowd with an easy confidence. Across the room, she saw Liam talking with Ben Carter, both of them laughing. Their company was thriving, a testament to their talent and integrity. Suddenly, a familiar face caught her eye. It was Arthur Lexington, the investor from that terrible night. He made his way over, a warm smile on his face. "Maricel," he said, extending a hand. "I came to your first show, and I was moved. This is a triumph." "Thank you, Arthur," she said, genuinely pleased. "You know," he continued, "your brother told me that night that a palace built on sand will always fall. Looking at this," he gestured to her art, "I see you've built your palace on solid rock." As he walked away, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see a kind-faced man holding 2 glasses of champagne. He was a literature professor she'd been seeing for a few months, a man who loved her stories, her art, and the strength he saw in her. "I believe one of these is for you," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. She took the glass, her fingers brushing his. To new foundations, he whispered, clinking his glass against hers. To new foundations, she repeated, her heart full. The past was a closed chapter, its lessons learned, its ghosts laid to rest. Her life, once a canvas controlled by another, was now her own masterpiece, vibrant and full of light. We've all felt trapped at some point in our lives, whether in a bad relationship, a dead-end job, or by the expectations of others. Marisol's story is a powerful reminder that even when you feel most powerless, you possess a strength you might not recognize. It's a story about how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of coming to light. And how the deepest betrayals can sometimes lead to the most profound liberations. It's about a sister's resilience and a brother's unwavering loyalty, proving that true family is not about a name or a legacy, but about who stands with you in the fire. If Marisol's journey from betrayal to triumph resonated with you, if you believe in the power of standing up for yourself and for those you love, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will inspire, shock, and empower you. Thank you for listening.